There was a time in America when food wasn't just something you ate. It was something you celebrated. Across small towns, river docks, dusty fairgrounds, and city streets, entire communities once gathered for festivals built around the foods they loved most. Giant kettles of stew simmered for days. Families hand-cranked ice cream under the summer sun. Fishermen hauled in fresh catches that were cooked right on the docks. These weren't corporate food festivals with sponsorship banners and ticketed VIP tents. They were local traditions. Events where farmers, fishermen, bakers, and neighbors came together to celebrate harvests, recipes, and flavors passed down for generations. But like many pieces of old America, these gatherings slowly disappeared. Some vanished because of changing laws. Others faded as industries modernized. And some were simply forgotten as younger generations moved away. Today, we're uncovering 25 food festivals in America that are now lost to history, celebrations that once defined entire communities. From massive riverside catfish feasts to chaotic tomato-throwing harvest parties, these festivals remind us of a time when food meant something more, when it brought entire towns together. This is the World Tapestry, and these are 25 food festivals in America that are now lost to history. Number 25. The Great American Tomato Throw Festival, Ohio. Imagine standing in the middle of a town square, surrounded by thousands of ripe red tomatoes. And suddenly, the signal is given. Within seconds, the air fills with flying fruit as crowds burst into laughter, ducking and throwing tomatoes in every direction. For a few chaotic hours, the streets of several small towns in Ohio transformed into something that looked more like a battlefield than a festival. But this unusual tradition actually had humble beginnings. In the early 20th century, local farmers often ended the harvest season with surplus tomatoes they couldn't sell. Rather than letting them rot, communities turned the leftovers into a celebration inspired loosely by European harvest traditions. Soon, the event grew into a full festival. Vendors sold tomato pies, fresh sauces, and sandwiches. Local bands played in the square. And the grand finale was always the same: a massive tomato throwing contest where anyone could join. For locals, it wasn't about wasting food. It was about celebrating the harvest and blowing off steam after months of hard work in the fields. But by the 1970s and 80s, attitudes toward food waste began to change. Insurance concerns grew, and local governments started worrying about safety and cleanup costs. Slowly, the tomato fights disappeared. Today, only photographs and newspaper clippings remain of the day entire towns turned bright red with laughter. But that chaotic harvest celebration was just one of many forgotten food festivals across America. Because further south, an even older tradition once simmered in giant iron pots for days. And it was centered around a mysterious southern stew known as burgoo. Number 24. The Kentucky Burgoo Stew Gathering. Imagine a stew so large, it had to be stirred with a wooden paddle. In small towns across Kentucky, burgoo wasn't just food. It was an event. Massive iron kettles were set over open fires, sometimes simmering for 2 full days before the festival even began. Burgoo itself was a legendary southern stew. Recipes varied wildly, but it often contained slow-cooked meats, vegetables, and spices blended into a rich, smoky dish. Some old recipes even included whatever meat hunters brought back that week. By the early 1900s, burgoo gatherings became a staple of local fairs, church fundraisers, and political rallies. Entire communities would gather around these giant kettles, waiting for the moment when the stew was finally ready. The smell alone could drift across entire towns. But over time, modern food safety laws made large open-air cooking events harder to organize. Health regulations, insurance costs, and changing lifestyles slowly pushed these gatherings out. Today, burgoo still exists in Kentucky kitchens, but the enormous all-day communal cookouts that once defined it are mostly gone. And yet, this disappearing tradition wasn't the only food celebration built around patience and teamwork. Because high in the Appalachian Mountains, another forgotten festival once required hours of stirring and generations of family recipes. Number 23. The Appalachian Apple Butter Stirring Festival. Long before supermarkets sold jars of apple butter, families in the Appalachian Mountains made it the old-fashioned way. And it took an entire day. During autumn harvests, communities gathered around enormous copper kettles filled with apples, sugar, and spices. The mixture simmered slowly over open fires while volunteers took turns stirring with long wooden paddles. But this wasn't just cooking. It was storytelling. Children played nearby while elders shared memories of past harvests. Musicians played fiddles. The smell of cinnamon and apples filled the mountain air. Apple butter festivals became seasonal highlights across parts of Tennessee, West Virginia, and Kentucky. But by the mid-20th century, store-bought spreads and modern food processing made the labor-intensive tradition less practical. As families moved to cities, fewer people knew how to make apple butter the old way, and the kettle slowly stopped boiling. Still, not every forgotten food festival happened in quiet mountain towns. Some once filled busy city streets with the sounds of immigrant traditions. And one of them revolved around something simple, yet iconic. A street pretzel. Number 22. The New York Pretzel Pushcart Festival. In the early 1900s, the smell of warm pretzels was everywhere in New York City. German immigrants had brought their baking traditions with them, and soon pretzels became one of the city's most beloved street foods. To celebrate the growing trade, vendors once held an unusual gathering known as the Pretzel Pushcart Festival. Pushcart bakers lined entire blocks, stacking fresh pretzels high on wooden trays while crowds sampled them fresh from portable ovens. It was noisy, busy, and wonderfully chaotic. For working-class immigrants, the pretzel wasn't just food. It was a symbol of opportunity. But as New York modernized, street vending regulations tightened. Pushcarts were gradually replaced by regulated food stands and commercial bakeries. The old festival faded away along with the carts that made it possible. Yet pretzels were hardly the only food tied deeply to immigrant heritage. Far to the north, another festival once honored a dish many Americans still struggle to pronounce, and even fewer still eat. Number 21. The Minnesota Lutefisk Winter Carnival. Every winter in parts of Minnesota, something unusual filled community halls. The unmistakable smell of lutefisk. This traditional Scandinavian dish, made from dried fish soaked in lye, was brought to America by Norwegian immigrants in the 1800s. And while many outsiders found the dish challenging, Scandinavian communities celebrated it proudly. Lutefisk winter festivals featured long banquet tables where families gathered to eat the gelatinous fish with butter, potatoes, and left spread. There were jokes, songs, and plenty of good-natured teasing about who could stomach the most. For immigrants, it was a powerful connection to the homeland they had left behind. But as younger generations assimilated into broader American culture, fewer people developed a taste for lutefisk. Attendance declined, and many festivals quietly disappeared. Still, the Midwest wasn't the only region where immigrant traditions shaped food celebrations. Along the East Coast, another dish once symbolized the very birth of a nation. And its festival honored a soup that supposedly helped win a war. Number 20. The Philadelphia Pepper Pot Parade. In Philadelphia, one soup carried the nickname, the soup that won the revolution. Pepper pot soup, made with tripe, vegetables, and black pepper, was famously served to hungry soldiers during the brutal winter of 1777. Over time, the dish became a symbol of American resilience. And for many years, local parades celebrated it. Street vendors served steaming bowls while marching bands passed through historic neighborhoods. The festival honored both the city's colonial past and the humble food that sustained early Americans. But tastes changed. Tripe became less popular. Traditional recipes faded from home kitchens. By the late 20th century, the pepper pot celebrations were mostly gone. Still, if Philadelphia honored a soup of survival, another region celebrated a seafood harvest that once defined its entire coastline. But the celebration would disappear for a much more troubling reason. Because the fish itself began to vanish. Number 19. Oregon's Salmon Smokehouse Festival. Along the rivers of Oregon, salmon once arrived in numbers so vast they seemed endless. For centuries, Native American tribes and early settlers alike relied on the fish for survival. To celebrate the harvest, communities hosted large smokehouse festivals where salmon were cleaned, salted, and smoked over wood fires. The smell of alder smoke drifted across the rivers while families worked side by side preparing the catch. The festivals honored both tradition and the abundance of nature. But by the mid-20th century, overfishing and dam construction dramatically reduced salmon populations. Conservation laws were introduced to protect the species, and large-scale harvest festivals became increasingly difficult to hold. The smokehouses grew quiet, but while salmon festivals faded due to environmental changes, another beloved celebration disappeared simply because cities themselves began to change. And nowhere was that transformation more dramatic than in Detroit. Number 18. The Detroit Cherry Pie Parade Festival. Imagine an entire city street filled with the sweet smell of freshly baked cherry pie. Tables lined the sidewalks. Bakery windows were stacked high with bright red desserts. And marching bands played as families gathered to celebrate one of Michigan's most beloved harvests. For many years in the early and mid-20th century, Detroit hosted a lively celebration known as the Cherry Pie Parade Festival, a tribute to the vast cherry orchards that thrived across northern Michigan. Michigan was, and still is, one of America's largest producers of tart cherries. Every summer, truckloads of the fruit traveled south to Detroit's bakeries and markets. The festival became a way for the city to celebrate both the harvest and the farmers who made it possible. Local bakeries competed to create the best cherry pie in the city. Schools marched in the parade carrying banners decorated with painted cherries. Families bought slices wrapped in wax paper, while musicians played on street corners. For a few days each year, cherry pie became more than just dessert. It became a symbol of regional pride. But as the decades passed, Detroit began to change. Industrial shifts, population movement, and economic challenges slowly transformed the city's neighborhoods. Many small bakeries closed. Local food celebrations struggled to survive. And eventually, the cherry pie parade faded away, leaving behind little more than scattered newspaper mentions and fading photographs. Yet the story of Detroit's lost cherry celebration wasn't unique. Across America, many food festivals vanished as cities modernized and communities evolved. And further down the Mississippi River, another gathering once brought entire towns together around something much simpler: a giant pan of sizzling catfish. Number 17. The Mississippi River Catfish Jubilee. Picture the banks of the Mississippi River on a warm summer evening. Rows of enormous cast-iron fryers bubble with hot oil. Fishermen unload their daily catch from wooden boats, and the air fills with the unmistakable smell of fresh catfish sizzling in cornmeal batter. For decades, small river towns along the Mississippi hosted a lively celebration known as the Catfish Jubilee, a festival dedicated to one of the river's most famous fish. Catfish had long been a staple of life along the Mississippi. Easy to catch and plentiful in the muddy waters, it became a reliable source of food for families, fishermen, and travelers passing through the region. By the early 1900s, communities began organizing annual festivals to celebrate the river's bounty. Local fishermen competed to bring in the largest catch, while volunteers worked tirelessly at massive outdoor cooking stations. Entire streets were lined with picnic tables where visitors could enjoy baskets overflowing with fried catfish, hush puppies, and coleslaw. Music played late into the night. Children ran between booths selling lemonade and homemade desserts. And the festival became a symbol of rivertown hospitality. But over time, things began to change. Environmental concerns about river pollution grew. Fishing regulations became stricter. And the logistics of hosting large outdoor cooking events became more complicated. Gradually, many of these riverbank celebrations disappeared. Today, catfish fries still happen in parts of the South, but the Grand Mississippi River Catfish Jubilee, once famous for feeding entire towns at once, has mostly faded into memory. Yet not every forgotten festival happened outdoors by a river. In one historic American city, a much quieter tradition once filled the streets every single Saturday. And it all revolved around a dish so famous that the city itself earned a nickname from it. Number 16. The Old Boston Baked Beans Saturday Festival. In the early days of Boston, Saturdays had a very particular smell. The slow, rich aroma of baked beans drifting through the narrow streets of the city. For centuries, Boston was so closely associated with this dish that it earned the nickname Beantown. But baked beans were more than just a meal. They were part of a weekly ritual. In colonial New England, families prepared baked beans every Saturday because the dish could cook slowly in brick ovens overnight without requiring work on Sunday, the traditional day of rest. Eventually, this weekly custom turned into something larger. Local markets and bakeries began celebrating the tradition with community gatherings where enormous clay pots of molasses-sweetened beans were served alongside brown bread and salted pork. Musicians played in public squares while vendors sold steaming bowls to workers finishing their week. For Boston residents, the Baked Bean Festival wasn't flashy, but it was comforting. It represented the simple traditions of a hardworking city. But as Boston modernized through the 20th century, lifestyles changed. Brick ovens disappeared from homes, and convenience foods replaced slow-cooked meals. The weekly gatherings gradually faded away. Yet food traditions rooted in patience and craftsmanship didn't only exist in Boston. Farther south, another summer festival once required even more patience and a lot more elbow grease. Because in Georgia, the star attraction wasn't beans. It was peach ice cream. Number 15. The Georgia Peach Ice Cream Turnoff. On hot summer afternoons in Georgia, crowds once gathered under shady trees with a single goal in mind: to make the best peach ice cream in the state. The Peach Ice Cream Turnoff was exactly what it sounded like: a friendly but fiercely competitive contest where families brought hand-cranked ice cream makers and competed to create the most delicious frozen dessert. Georgia peaches were famous across America for their sweetness and flavor, and local communities proudly celebrated the harvest every summer. Participants chopped fresh peaches, mixed cream and sugar, and then spent hours turning heavy wooden churns packed with ice and salt. Children often took turns cranking the handles while adults guarded their secret recipes. It wasn't fast work, but that was part of the charm. The reward came when the lid was finally lifted and the creamy peach ice cream was scooped into paper cups for eager crowds. But as electric appliances and commercial ice cream brands became dominant, the slow art of hand-churning faded. The festival gradually disappeared as fewer families owned traditional churns. Still, Georgia's Peach Festival wasn't the only celebration built around agriculture. Out on the wide open plains, another sweet tradition once honored the quiet work of thousands of bees. Number 14. The Kansas Sunflower Honey Harvest Fair. Across the golden fields of Kansas, sunflowers once stretched toward the horizon like living waves of yellow. And hidden among those fields were thousands of busy workers. Bees. For many farming communities, honey production was an important part of rural life. To celebrate the harvest, towns hosted the Sunflower Honey Harvest Fair, where beekeepers proudly displayed their golden jars of honey. Visitors sampled honey straight from the comb. Children watched demonstrations showing how honey was extracted and bottled. And bakers competed to create the best honey cakes, pies, and breads. The festival celebrated both nature and the quiet partnership between farmers and pollinators. But over time, large-scale industrial agriculture changed how honey was produced and distributed. Small family apiaries struggled to compete with commercial operations. As fewer local beekeepers remained, the fairs that once celebrated them slowly faded away. Yet not every forgotten food festival was tied to farming. Some were tied to art. And in the dairy heartland of America, that art form had a very unusual medium: butter. Number 13. The Wisconsin Butter Sculpture Fair. In the dairy state of Wisconsin, butter has always been more than just an ingredient. At one time, it was also a form of art. During the early 20th century, county fairs and festivals across Wisconsin hosted remarkable competitions where sculptors carved elaborate statues entirely from butter. Cows, farmers, historical figures, even entire scenes, were shaped from massive chilled blocks of the creamy yellow substance. Visitors marveled at the creativity while local dairy producers proudly displayed the region's most famous export. The Butter Sculpture Fair became both a celebration of agriculture and a showcase of artistic talent. But maintaining these sculptures required special refrigeration equipment, and as costs rose, many small festivals struggled to keep the tradition alive. Gradually, the butter sculptures disappeared from most fairs. Yet while Wisconsin celebrated dairy in artistic form, high in the mountains of the West, another festival focused on something far simpler: fresh fish. caught only hours before it was served. Number 12. The Colorado Rocky Mountain Trout Cookout. In the clear streams of the Rocky Mountains, trout once thrived in cold, fast-moving water. For fishermen and mountain communities in Colorado, the trout harvest was worth celebrating. And so was the flavor. The Rocky Mountain Trout Cookout brought together anglers, chefs, and visitors for a festival where freshly caught trout were grilled, smoked, or pan-fried right beside the rivers where they were caught. Fishermen competed to bring in the largest or most beautiful fish, while cooks experimented with spices and cooking techniques. For visitors, it was a rare chance to taste trout only hours after it had left the water. But conservation efforts to protect fragile trout populations eventually limited large-scale fishing events. Strict regulations were introduced to preserve the species and the mountain ecosystems they depended on. The cookouts slowly faded away. Yet some forgotten festivals weren't built around fish or fruit. Some were built around recipes so unusual, they surprised anyone hearing about them for the first time. And in Pennsylvania, one of those desserts was known as shoofly pie. Number 11. The Great Pennsylvania Shoofly Pie Day. In the rolling farmland of Pennsylvania Dutch country, a dessert with an unusual name once had its own festival. Shoofly pie. The molasses-filled treat earned its name from the swarms of flies that bakers had to constantly shoo away, while the sweet filling cooled on windowsills. Despite the name, the pie became a beloved staple among Amish and Mennonite communities. Eventually, small towns began hosting Shoofly Pie Day, where bakeries and home cooks competed to create the richest, most flavorful versions of the dessert. Tables were filled with dozens of pies, some gooey and wet, others crumbly and cake-like. Visitors traveled from neighboring states just to taste the regional specialty. But over time, the pie's popularity declined outside Amish communities. Modern desserts replaced the old molasses recipes, and the festivals gradually lost attendance. Today, shoofly pie still exists in a few bakeries, but the large public celebrations dedicated to it are mostly gone. Yet as beloved as these sweet traditions were, they were nothing compared to one seafood festival in the South that once attracted thousands of hungry visitors every year. And it all revolved around a tiny shellfish known as crawfish. Number 10. The Louisiana Crawfish King Day Feast. In the bayous of Louisiana, there was once a day when the swell of boiling crawfish could travel for miles. Huge steel pots bubbled over open flames. Tables were covered with newspaper, and mountains of bright red crawfish were poured out for crowds eager to dig in. This gathering was known in some communities as Crawfish King Day, a celebration that marked the height of crawfish season in the Gulf South. For generations, crawfish were a cornerstone of Cajun cooking. Fishermen hauled traps from muddy waters, bringing in sacks of the small shellfish that locals affectionately called mudbugs. The festival turned that harvest into a full community event. Families gathered for enormous crawfish boils where the shellfish were cooked with corn, potatoes, garlic, and powerful Cajun spices. Music from accordions and fiddles filled the air as people laughed, peeled crawfish, and shared stories long into the evening. But as Louisiana's seafood industry grew more commercial, crawfish harvests became dominated by large-scale production and restaurant supply chains. Many of the small, informal community festivals slowly faded away. The crawfish boil itself survived, but the large communal celebrations that once defined Crawfish King Day became much rarer. And yet, Louisiana wasn't the only place where cooking over open fire became a festival. Farther west, another celebration recreated the rugged meals of the Old West frontier. Number 9. The Texas Chuckwagon Cook-Off Jubilee. Long before modern food trucks, there were chuck wagons. On the cattle trails of Texas, chuck wagons served as mobile kitchens for cowboys driving herds across the vast plains. These wagons carried everything needed to feed hungry ranch hands after long days in the saddle. By the early 20th century, Texans began celebrating this frontier tradition with large events known as the Chuckwagon Cook-Off Jubilee. Dozens of teams brought authentic wagons and cooked meals the same way cowboys had done decades earlier, over open fires beneath the wide Texas sky. Visitors watched cooks prepare beans, biscuits, stews, and Dutch oven desserts using only traditional tools and ingredients. The festival wasn't just about food. It was about honoring the spirit of the American West. But maintaining authentic chuck wagons and organizing large outdoor cooking events required time, land, and resources that became harder to secure. As rural life modernized, many of these historical cook-offs quietly disappeared. Still, Texas wasn't the only place where simple foods became the centerpiece of community gatherings. In the American heartland, one humble dish once united farm families every summer. Number 8. The Iowa Cornbread Picnic Festival. Across the rolling farmland of Iowa, summer picnics were once a cherished tradition. And at the center of many of those gatherings was a food so simple it barely required a recipe: cornbread. The Cornbread Picnic Festival began as a community potluck where farm families brought their favorite versions of the classic dish, some sweet, some savory, some baked in heavy cast-iron skillets over open fires. Tables stretched across grassy fields as neighbors shared meals made from the very crops they grew themselves. Cornbread was a symbol of the region's agricultural roots. Made from locally grown corn, it represented the hard work and independence of Midwestern farming communities. But as family farms declined and rural populations shrank, the large community picnics that once defined these festivals became harder to organize. The tradition slowly faded. Yet while Midwestern festivals celebrated simple farm food, on the West Coast, one waterfront city once hosted a seafood gathering unlike any other. And it happened right where the fish were caught. Number 7. The San Francisco Dungeness Crab Dock Feast. Along the bustling waterfront of San Francisco, fishermen once celebrated the opening of crab season with an unforgettable event. The Dungeness Crab Dock Feast. Boats returned to harbor loaded with traps full of the region's prized crustacean, Dungeness crab. Instead of sending the entire catch straight to markets, fishermen set aside part of it for a public celebration held directly on the docks. Huge boiling pots were set up beside the fishing boats. Fresh crab was cooked within hours of being pulled from the Pacific Ocean. Visitors gathered around wooden tables where piles of cracked crab legs were served with sourdough bread, melted butter, and lemon. For locals, it was a perfect blend of food, fishing culture, and coastal pride. But as San Francisco's waterfront transformed through redevelopment, the working docks that once hosted the feast gradually disappeared. Commercial fishing operations moved elsewhere, and the dockside celebration faded with them. Still, long before crab feasts filled the docks of San Francisco, another California tradition was born much earlier, during the chaotic days of the gold rush. And it revolved around a bread so unique it carried its own living history: sourdough. Number 6. The California Gold Rush Sourdough Fair. During the California Gold Rush of 1849, thousands of miners flooded into the rugged hills of the West in search of fortune. But gold wasn't the only thing they depended on to survive. They also relied on a special kind of bread: sourdough. Miners carried jars of fermented dough starter wherever they went. The natural yeast inside allowed them to bake bread even in remote camps far from bakeries. Over time, the tradition became legendary. To honor this unique culinary heritage, some California towns hosted gatherings known as the Gold Rush Sourdough Fair. Bakers competed to produce the best loaves using traditional starters, some of which had been passed down for generations. Visitors sampled crusty bread fresh from wood-fired ovens while storytellers shared tales of miners and frontier life. But as commercial bakeries replaced small local operations, many historic sourdough traditions became less visible. The fairs slowly disappeared. Yet while sourdough celebrated the rugged survival of miners, another coastal festival once honored something far more luxurious: a seafood feast buried beneath hot sand along the beaches of New England. And it was known simply as the Clam Bake Carnival. Number 5. The New England Clam Bake Carnival. Along the rocky shores of New England, summer once meant something very special. The scent of salt air, the sound of waves rolling onto the beach, and the unmistakable smell of seafood cooking beneath the sand. For generations, coastal communities held grand gatherings known as the Clam Bake Carnival. The tradition dated back centuries. Native American tribes originally taught early settlers how to cook seafood in earth ovens. Stones were heated in large pits dug into the sand, then layered with seaweed, clams, lobster, corn, and potatoes before being covered and left to steam. By the late 1800s, this cooking method had evolved into a full summer celebration. Families traveled from miles away to attend these seaside feasts. Musicians played near bonfires while volunteers carefully uncovered the steaming pits, revealing piles of freshly cooked shellfish. For visitors, it was more than just a meal. It was a celebration of coastal life. But over time, strict environmental protections and coastal regulations made large beach fires and sand pits difficult to organize. As tourism replaced small fishing communities, many of these traditional clam-bake carnivals slowly disappeared. Yet while New England celebrated seafood buried beneath the sand, farther south, another coastal region built an entire festival around a dessert so famous that it became a symbol of the islands themselves. A pie made with tiny, tart citrus fruit. Number 4. The Florida Key Lime Pie Jubilee. In the early days of the Florida Keys, one dessert ruled them all: key lime pie. Made from the small, intensely tart key limes native to the islands, the creamy dessert quickly became a local legend. To celebrate the fruit harvest and the region's unique culinary identity, island communities once hosted an event known as the Key Lime Pie Jubilee. Bakeries, restaurants, and home cooks competed to make the perfect version of the pie. Some used traditional condensed milk recipes. Others experimented with whipped toppings or graham cracker crusts. Visitors sampled dozens of variations while musicians played tropical tunes under swaying palm trees. The festival captured the laid-back spirit of island life. But as tourism boomed in the Florida Keys during the late 20th century, many small local traditions struggled to survive. Large commercial events replaced intimate community celebrations. And slowly, the original Key Lime Pie Jubilee faded away. Still, not every forgotten food festival happened in quiet coastal towns. Some once filled the streets of America's largest cities. And in Chicago, one of the liveliest celebrations revolved around something surprisingly simple: pickles. Number 3. The Chicago Maxwell Street Pickle Festival. For decades, Maxwell Street in Chicago was one of the busiest and most colorful marketplaces in America. Immigrant vendors from across Europe filled the crowded street with food stalls, music, and lively bargaining. Among the many foods sold there, one stood out: pickles. Barrels of fermented cucumbers lined the sidewalks, where vendors pulled them fresh from brine and handed them to customers wrapped in paper. Eventually, the popularity of these vendors inspired a unique celebration known as the Maxwell Street Pickle Festival. The festival honored the immigrant communities who had shaped Chicago's food culture. Crowds gathered to taste pickles flavored with garlic, dill, mustard seeds, and secret family recipes passed down for generations. But as the city expanded during the late 20th century, large urban redevelopment projects transformed the Maxwell Street neighborhood. Historic markets were relocated or demolished, and the lively pickle festival vanished along with them. Yet one of the most visually striking food festivals in America wasn't held in a city street at all. It happened in the heart of the Midwestern prairie, and it involved something far more unusual than pickles: entire buildings made from corn. Number 2. The Midwest Corn Palace Harvest Feast. In the plains of South Dakota, farmers once celebrated their harvest in a truly spectacular way by building entire palaces out of corn. The famous Corn Palace Harvest Feast was inspired by agricultural pride during the late 1800s, when Midwestern communities wanted to showcase the incredible abundance of their crops. Artists carefully arranged thousands of ears of corn, each with different colors and textures, into enormous murals covering the walls of large buildings. Inside, visitors gathered for harvest feasts featuring roasted corn, cornbread, and countless dishes made from the region's most important crop. It was both a festival and a symbol of prosperity. But over time, the large harvest celebrations that once surrounded the Corn Palace became smaller and less frequent. Industrial farming replaced many small family operations, and community harvest feasts slowly faded. Yet, even this spectacular corn celebration was not the most iconic forgotten food festival in America. Because across the country, one fruit once brought together farmers, towns, and travelers every single autumn: the apple. Number 1. The Forgotten National Apple Harvest Festival. Long before large commercial orchards dominated the apple industry, harvest season in many American towns was a time of celebration. Families gathered in orchards as trees bent under the weight of ripe apples ready to be picked. Communities across the country hosted apple harvest festivals where farmers pressed fresh cider, baked pies, and shared the fruits of the season. Barrels of apples lined country roads while visitors enjoyed hayrides through orchards glowing with autumn colors. The festivals celebrated more than just fruit. They celebrated the rhythm of the farming year, the reward after months of planting, pruning, and patience. But as agriculture became more industrialized and rural populations declined, many of these small-town harvest festivals quietly disappeared. Today, a few still survive. But the widespread network of local apple celebrations that once defined autumn in America has largely faded into history. And with them went a way of life built around the land, the seasons, and the simple joy of sharing food with neighbors. Food festivals once told the story of America in the most delicious way possible. They celebrated harvests, honored immigrant traditions, and brought entire communities together around simple meals. From riverside catfish fries, to mountain apple butter kettles, to seaside clam bakes buried beneath the sand, these gatherings weren't just about food. They were about belonging. Today, many of them have disappeared, but their stories remain. And every forgotten recipe, festival, and tradition is another thread in the rich tapestry of history. If you enjoyed this journey into America's forgotten food traditions, be sure to subscribe to the World Tapestry, where every story helps uncover the past one thread at a time. And until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the stories history almost forgot.